Welcome back to Phoenix Podcast, hosted by Amin Moanian, where we like to, we take a deep dive into the world of politics and economics.
Mhm.
And today, today we're tackling a topic that's pretty close to my heart, I think. And it's the idea that government, the big guys, might not always have the answers to
Uh,
every problem. It's something that we don't often think about. But what if sometimes the cure is worse than the disease?
yeah, that's a great way to put it. We're so used to hearing about market failure, when businesses pollute or they jack up prices, and then the automatic response is often government needs to step in. But what about when the government gets it wrong?
Exactly. It's like we assume they have this magic wand that can fix everything. But we all know from experience that even the best intentions can go sideways. Think about, I don't know, maybe a city council deciding to control rent prices to try to make housing more affordable.
Perfect example. Sounds good on paper, right?
Yeah.
But they often happens as landlord, faced with lower profits, might cut back on maintenance or even stop renting altogether. Suddenly there are fewer affordable apartments available.
It's like squeezing a balloon. You push down on one side and it bulges out on the other. There are always consequences, intended or not.
Right, and that's what economists call government failure, when the government's intervention in the market actually makes things worse or creates a whole new set of problems.
So it's not about saying that the government is bad or anything. It's more about recognizing that they're not infallible.
Precisely, they don't have perfect information. They can be swayed by powerful interests. And sometimes, let's face it, bureaucratic incentives don't always align with what's best for everyone.
And that's where things get really interesting. Because, if we're going to talk about solutions to complex problems, we need to understand both sides of the coin, market failures and government failures.
I think a lot of folks would be surprised to learn how much thought economists have put into this, particularly those from the Austrian school. They really emphasized the limitations of central planning and how difficult it is for governments to have the same kind of knowledge and responsiveness as a free market.
So let's dig into some of the specific ways things can go wrong. We've touched on a few already, but I'm sure there's some juicy examples out there.
Oh, absolutely. From misallocated resources to unintended consequences, there's a whole spectrum of government failure to explore. Let's dive in, shall we?
Let's do it.
One thing that always kind of strikes me is how often governments kind of get tripped up. But, well, not knowing everything, it sounds obvious, but they just don't have the same kind of information as all the individual buyers and sellers in a market.
It's like when you try to plan a surprise party, but you forget to ask the birthday person what they actually like. So you end up with a clown, and they're terrified of clowns. Total disaster.
Exactly. And in economics, prices are like those crucial bits of information. They tell businesses what people want, how much they're willing to pay, and where to direct resources. When governments try to set prices artificially, like with rent control, it disrupts that whole signaling process.
So it's not just about good intentions. It's also about having the right information to actually act on those intentions. So what else can make things go wrong?
Well, let's talk about politics. Even if a government has good information, they're still operating in a political environment. There are always different interest groups, vying for influence, lobbying for policies that benefit them, even if it's at the expense of the broader public.
Ah, yes, the good old concentrated benefits, dispersed costs scenario, like when a small industry gets a big subsidy. But the cost is spread out over millions of taxpayers who barely even notice.
Precisely. And this is where public choice theory comes in handy. It helps us understand how politicians, even well-intentioned ones, are incentivized to respond to those concentrated interests, especially when those groups are the ones who fund their campaigns.
So it's not necessarily corruption, but just the reality of how the system works, and that can lead to some pretty skewed outcomes.
Absolutely. Then you got the whole issue of bureaucracy. Government agencies, by their very nature, tend to grow and expand over time. They develop their own internal cultures, priorities, and let's be honest, a desire to protect their turf.
It's like that old saying, a government bureaucracy is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth.
Right, and this can lead to situations where programs that were once necessary become bloated and inefficient, or where agencies end up working at cross purposes because no one wants to give up their little piece of the pie.
So you've got information problems, political pressures, and bureaucratic inertia. It's like trying to steer a ship through a hurricane while blindfolded and with one hand tied behind your back.
A vivid image. And let's not forget about the human tendency to focus on the short term. Politicians, especially in democracies, are always thinking about the next election. This can make them hesitant to take on tough long-term challenges, even if those are the ones that really need addressing.
It's that classic kick the can down the road mentality. Deal with the immediate problem, even if it means creating a bigger mess for someone else later on.
Exactly, and that's something that Austrian economists have highlighted time and again, the importance of understanding time preference. How individuals, and yes, governments, tend to prioritize present benefits over future costs. It's human nature, but it can have some pretty nasty consequences.
So we've got information gaps, political incentives, bureaucratic bloat, and a bias towards short-term thinking. Are you starting to paint a rather bleak picture of government intervention here?
Not necessarily. It's important to remember that markets can fail too, and sometimes government intervention. It's absolutely necessary, but we need to be realistic about the challengers and understand that government isn't a magic bullet.
So it's about finding the right balance, right? Recognizing the limitations of both markets and governments, and trying to find solutions that leverage the strengths of each.
Exactly. It's about being thoughtful, pragmatic, and recognizing that there are no easy answers when it comes to complex social and economic problems.
Well said. But let's not get too lost in the theoretical weeds here. I think our listeners would love to hear some real-world examples of how this government failure thing actually plays out.
Oh, I've got a few doozies up my sleeve. How about we dive into a case study or two? I think it'll really bring these concepts to life.
So we've talked about, how governments can sometimes stumble a little bit when they try to fix things, but I think our listeners are probably wondering, okay, so what? Like, what can we actually do about it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, if we accept that governments aren't perfect, it doesn't mean we just throw up our hands and say, well, nothing can be done.
Yeah, that's not exactly a recipe for progress, is it?
Right. It's more about, I think, shifting our perspective. Instead of just assuming that government intervention is always the answer, we need to be a little bit more critical. Ask some questions like, what are the potential unintended consequences here? Or is there a way to achieve this goal without relying solely on government action?
So it's a bit more like measure twice, cut once when it comes to policy.
Exactly. And this is where I think those insights from classic liberalism and that Austrian school, they come in handy. They remind us that markets, for all their imperfections, can be incredibly powerful mechanisms for coordinating information, allocating resources, and, fostering innovation.
So it's not about choosing sides, right? Like government versus markets. It's about finding the right kind of balance.
Precisely. And that balance is going to vary, depending on the specific problem that we're trying to solve. Sometimes a light touch regulation might be all that's needed. Other times, a more direct intervention might be necessary. But the key is to be thoughtful, to weigh the potential costs and benefits, and to be open to adjusting course if things aren't working as planned.
That sounds like a pretty tall order for our political leaders.
It is, but it's also, I think, the kind of leadership that we need if we want to tackle these really complex challenges that we're facing. And it all starts with us. It starts with the citizens, demanding more from those who represent us. We need to be informed, we need to be engaged, and we need to be willing to push back against these simplistic solutions and ideological dogma.
Well said. So as we're wrapping up this deep dive into the world of government failure, what's that one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think it really boils down to this. Be skeptical. Don't blindly accept the narrative that government always has the answer. Ask questions. Consider alternatives. And remember that the most effective solutions often involve a really carefully tailored blend of market forces and government policies, designed for the specific problem at hand.
Great advice and a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of government failure. Remember, folks, the more we understand about how the world works, the better equipped we are to make it work for us. Until next time, stay curious.